It's 11 o'clock, and this is Armijo's Old Spanish Trail, Santa Fe to LA class. If we're all at the right location. Today's agenda will kind of try and answer some questions. What's this class about? Why go to Santa Fe or LA? Is Spanish Trail a misnomer? Why didn't Armijo take Route 66 or the interstates? How did Armijo find his way? And which way did Armijo go? First of all, I would like to thank retirement. It gives us the chance to do what we're interested in. My interests include data analysis, maps, geotagging landscapes, that's labeling what we see in the landscape, and developing travel guides. In retirement, we can do research for the sake of research. We don't need to reach a conclusion. We don't need to make a recommendation. We don't need to take any action. We can do research just for the joy of researching. My current research project is analyzing Armijo's Travelway. A possible use is an ebook highway travel guide. How many have iPads or iPhones? Wow. That's the best format for programming as far as ebooks go, but the advantage of an ebook is linkage. You can touch a point on a photograph and be linked to a glossary that tells you what you are seeing. So that's the advantage of ebooks. The disadvantage, particularly on smartphones, is the size of the screen. So it's kind of an experiment. I've done one guide for shuttle stops, Zion National Park shuttle stops, landscape guide, and glossary. And so I've tried that, and it seemed to work, but I'm kind of looking at maybe doing a travelway guide from St. George to Santa Fe and St. George to LA. My sightseeing motto is information adds value to what we see. My past classes, I've talked about landscape features, geology, history of map names, and I've kind of expanded it, or trying to expand it to add the history of travelways. The purpose of this class is to share research information that I found interesting. It's also self-serving in that it makes me organize what I've learned, and I can avoid research for the sake of research. I've got a functionality background, so it's nice to have a function for something. And anyway, disclaimers. Spanish Trail is a misnomer. This class will be focused more on places than people. It's a work in progress. I'm still learning. It's been a quick study. Last year I couldn't spell Spanish Trail, but I've learned a lot. Some content will be approximately correct, but precisely wrong. And we'll take a few detours. We'll look at some trivia along the way. How many have taken chemistry? Do you know what a dry lab is? It's writing a report without doing the experiment. A lot of the places I'm going to be talking about, unfortunately, I haven't seen, but they're on my list. If you've taken my classes before, you've heard the sad story of why I became an engineer. Math was easy, but I didn't have the personality to become an accountant. So my background includes I've worked for consultants in San Francisco, Portland, Salt Lake. I've retired from the U.S. Forest Service, and I've retired from the Utah Department of Transportation. Who has been to Oregon? Well, then don't answer this question. How do you pronounce W-I-L-L-A-M-E-T-T-E? Willamette. But when we first moved to Oregon, it was Willamette. How do you pronounce W-E-B-E-R? Not in Michigan. I stayed at a motel on Weber Avenue. In Santa Arbor. I was attending a conference and I got lost. And I kept asking people where Weber Avenue was. So the disclaimer is there are a lot of Indian names and Spanish names that I'm not going to be able to pronounce. So bear with me, please. Class objectives. I'll turn up the lights to keep you awake. Hopefully you will remember something about landscapes, geology, water in the desert, Armijo's old Spanish travelway, and places to visit between St. George, Santa Fe, St. George, LA, and kind of help you see what I see when I look at the landscape. Tentative class schedule, and this is a little bit expanded from what's in the learning link, is today we're going to discuss which way did Armijo go. Next week will be, it isn't easy becoming a National Historic Trail. New Mexico Travelway Shadow Highway sightseeing. So we'll be doing sightseeing along the highways. And one class will be on New Mexico, another class will be on the Arizona-Utah border area, another class, Nevada, and the final class, California. The previous classes hopefully lay some foundation for the sightseeing along the highways. Stereo vision is 3D vision. Each eye provides a separate overlapping view. We take the two views plus brain fusion and we get depth perception. If you hold your hand over one eye, you will lose some depth perception. How many have seen one of these? Yeah. Okay. Have you heard of Oliver Wendell Holmes? He invented it. He was a physician, a poet, and a master of many trades. Does that sound right? Junior was his son. So he's the father of the Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes. The stereoscope helps us focus the eyes so that two photos are viewed like normal vision, thus a 3D view. Geologists take these out in the field when they map to give them stereoscope vision or 3D vision from aerial photos. Some geologists have trained their eyes so that they can see 3D without using a stereoscope when looking at two aerial photos. I was never able to do that with much ease. Google Earth is the class stereoscope. Aerial photos plus computer vision gives us a 3D perspective. I can see Colorado City, Fredonia. The red line is the proposed location of Armijo's Travelway. The white line is Arizona Highway 389. I also see some geology. I see the chocolate, vermilion, and white cliffs from the Grand Staircase. Why go to Santa Fe? Today, traveling from St. George, there are sights to see in Santa Fe or LA, and there are sights along the way. In 1829, woolen goods were picked up in Santa Fe and traded for horses and mules in LA. Spanish-American commerce travelways between 1829 and 1848 have become national historic trails. We will be looking at the Yellow Travelway, which was followed by Armijo and passes through St. George. Armijo's journey started in Abiquiu, but he probably picked up some woolen goods in Santa Fe. The significance of the dates, 1829 was when he made his trip. It was the first commerce trip between Santa Fe and LA. What's the significance of 1848? That's when the territory became part of the U.S. That's when the Mexicans lost the war. There will be a class where we look at the history of LA and Santa Fe, and the classes will be on the territory geographic history. Spanish Trail, I believe, is a misnomer. A trail is a mark or series of signs or objects left behind by the passage of someone or something. What's the probability of 60 mounted men and a caravan of a pack of animals leaving a trace or physical evidence that can be seen after more than 180 years? If trails are visible today, I believe they were probably followed by Armijo, not created by him. So trail is the misnomer. I prefer travelway. Others have referred to corridors or routes. The Spanish used these travelways between 1829 and 1848. The Indians used many of these segments for many more years. I guess there is some resentment by some of the tribes that possibly there should be national historic Indian trails, more so than Spanish trails. If we take a trip from St. George, the blue lines are the recommended routes using Google Earth. They're based upon shortest travel time. So we can see going between Santa Fe and Los Angeles is quite a bit longer than taking the interstates, or pretty much coincides with historical Route 66. I think there was a proposal to make Route 66 a historical trail, but anyway, this is the way Google Earth recommends. On GPSs, you not only have the option to route based upon shortest travel time, you can also route yourself based upon shortest distance. But I believe Google Earth defaults to shortest travel time. The Google route from St. George shadows Armijo's Travelway, which is in yellow, at many locations. So that's how we came up with shadow highways for the last 4 classes. Some of the highways not shown are closer to Armijo's Travelway. In this class, sightseeing will be along paved highways. Let's get some more information before we speculate why Armijo didn't take the more direct route. 848 miles compared to 1,005 miles going through St. George, which would have saved 10 to 15 travel days. Let's start by knowing that Armijo traveled during the winter with horses and mules. Armijo's trip from Abiquiu to Mission San Gabriel. It was a trade caravan authorized by New Mexico Minister of Interior and Foreign Relations. It was the first commerce caravan between Santa Fe and LA. It's considered one of the most arduous of all trade routes ever established in the United States. He left November 7th and arrived January 31st. It took about 86 days. It involved 60 men with approximately twice as many mules. 74 campsite locations are identified in his journal. He traded wool blankets and got horses and mules in return. It's roughly a 2-to-1 ratio. So for 2 blankets, you could probably get 1 horse or 1 mule. This November 7th to January 31st alignment may have been a one-time event. Segments of the Armijo National Historic Trail alignment probably were extensively used as travelways before and after Armijo's trip. Armijo started in Abiquiu, but I've extended the class to Santa Fe. In the brackets is the technical or official name for Santa Fe, which is too long to pronounce. Santa Fe was the origin of most commerce and travel to LA between 1829 and 1848. It was possibly the source of Armijo's woolen blankets. There are many sites of historical interest between Abiquiu and Santa Fe, and that's why it's been added to the class. What, did he have a map? Let's review what a map is. A map is a graphical depiction emphasizing relationships between elements in some space and can be based upon observations, hearsay, geography, assumptions, and measurements. Today, most of our maps are based on measurements. Maps indicate historical state of knowledge or beliefs about geography. They're not always factual. From early Spanish explorations, there could have been more known about travel conditions along the interstates or Route 66 in the vicinity of the 35th parallel than Armijo's route, which traveled along or in the vicinity of the 37th parallel. Do you know what parallels are? Yeah, they're lines of latitude. The 37th parallel is also the boundary between states. It's the boundary between Utah and Arizona and Colorado and New Mexico. Armijo's travelway is the dashed line. I don't know if you can make it out. That's his travelway. Probably there was local knowledge close to home. Abiquiu was first settled by the Spaniards in about 1740. Armijo probably was aware of Dominguez Escalante trip in 1776. That's the green line. There was a detailed journal and map documenting their travels. He possibly was aware that Jebediah Smith traveled from the Dominguez Escalante route to the coast or to LA. He probably didn't have any details as to how he went, but he probably got an idea that it was feasible to travel from Utah to LA in the vicinity of, in that route. Rafael Riviera, a scout and member of his party, was familiar with the LA area. He traveled from Mexico to LA the year before. And Armijo used the services of an Indian guide in western Arizona. This showed Dominguez and Escalante were going to Northern California. They weren't going to LA. Winter was coming and they returned to Santa Fe after reaching Utah Lake. Being good Padres, they made the decision to go home by casting lots. Mayra, a religious artist and map maker, was a member of the expedition. Artists frequently were map makers, and this is his map that he created in 1778. And I don't know if you can, the numbers try and identify different areas. Number one is the Great Salt Lake. Now, Dominguez Escalante never got there, so this was geographical hearsay. They heard it existed from the Indians. We can see that Utah Lake, this is a 1776 map. Utah Lake is identified by 2. Rio Grande River, lower right, is by a 3, and the Rio Grande passes Santa Fe. Gila River is 5. And do you see the big mistake, which is 6? What's the big mistake? There's an outlet to the Great Salt Lake. That's a major mistake, as we'll find out in future explorations. These maps also included information about location of different Indian tribes. This again is a blow up along these 37th parallels. So from Mayra's map, he could see that there were some major rivers along his route, or at least in the vicinity of the 37th parallel. What do we see along the 35th parallel? There are mountains. There's also other information that may not be able to be read. I don't know if you can see, but this map also indicates that there are Mescalero Apaches in the mountain areas. And I'm not sure if they were hostile at that time or not. But this is information that possibly was available to Armijo. State of knowledge in 1825. Essentially, the maps of large areas didn't show travelways. They showed territories, they showed rivers, mountain ranges, and they showed location of Indian tribes. Can you see the big mistakes? Let's try this. All the major rivers. This is a hydrology, a mistake in hydrology beliefs. So the major rivers will drain to the coast. And we know that's not the case. What else do we see? We see the major rivers all flow east, and at that time they believed they all flowed to the Mississippi River, which generally is correct. The green shows the location of the different Spanish trails. Fremont corrected the mistake, and this map shows that there's a basin, that the rivers do not flow to the ocean as believed. But as we can see from the previous map, the belief that there were rivers that went to the ocean was continued at least through 1825. Let's take a detour. Let's look at some trivia. Forgot to ask the question. Why are lakes salty?
No outlet.
There's no outlet. That's right. So let's look at the salinity in the salt lake. It's 5 to 27%. It's quite more dense than oceans, which are only 3.5%. And the Dead Sea is higher, which is over 30%. But Utah Lake does drain to the Salt Lake, but there is no outlet for the Salt Lake, and that's why we have the salt content. Let's do some subsequent justification by looking at Google Earth. Along the 35th parallel or Route 66 or interstate routes, what do we see? The green areas are mountains. So Armijo traveled during the winter, and what do we have in the mountains? Snow. The other thing is that horses and mules don't like steep grades. So it probably was a wise choice. I'm not sure what he knew, but it was a wise choice. He didn't go the 35th parallel route. Considering today's information, USGS current perennial streams and springs are in a database. All the blue areas indicate locations of springs and perennial streams. Perennial means it flows just about all year long, except during major droughts. And this is based upon 2018 information. But again, it looks like he made the right choice. There's a lot more. The black is Armijo's route. The red is again, the interstate route. And the arrows point to some locations that look pretty dry based upon today's knowledge or today's database. So again, it looks like he made a wise choice of going further by going to the north than taking the more direct route between Santa Fe and LA. Which way did Armijo go? He recorded campsite landmarks in a journal. Armijo kept a journal of campsites which were identified by place names. The names underlined with red correspond to names on today's maps. These are existing map names. English translations are in brackets. Arroyo de Agua, it's a water wash. Kaplan is choke cherry. West of New Mexico, the campsite names primarily refer to landscape descriptions, not map names. On the 19th, he was at San Lazaro River, which today is called the Mancos, but at those times, I think the names probably were somewhat interchangeable. So in New Mexico, we have, frequently we have map names that correspond to his campsites. But once we go further west, his campsites primarily refer to landscape descriptions. And defining exact locations involves major interpretations. Let's take another detour. How do names get on maps? Before 1890, map names were determined by topographers and explorations. They had a license pretty much to call it what they wanted. The problem was the same place could have different names on different maps. There needed to be some standardization. After 1890, map names were determined by a federal board on geographic names. Hopefully now locations only have one name and meet some standards. All of us here can submit names for locations on a map. What do you think of Vandre Mountain? Is that? I vote for that. That sounds good. However, we'll need to fill out a form, follow some rules, and get board approval. Approval criteria includes not previously named, common usage, a person must be deceased for 5 years before their name can be considered, acceptance by local governments, and today they must be politically correct. There was a book written about map names that were not politically correct. How maps name, claim, and inflame. I kind of edited what the politically incorrect was. A database of map names was created about 1980 and is accessible on the web. You can find this database by doing a Google search on USBGN, which is United States Board on Geographic Names. We can do a search of this database. Let's back up a little bit. And let's do a search for Abiquiu. Is that the correct pronunciation, Steve?
I think so.
Okay, thank you.
That's the way all the people I've talked with say.
Okay. Search results here include all map names related to Abiquiu in New Mexico. It includes the populated places, which was the origin for Armijo's travels, dams, buildings, benches, and it also includes some names that are somewhat related to Abiquiu. It includes information about the county. In this case, I only did a search for New Mexico, but you could do a search for the entire country. It gives longitude and latitude, elevation. It tells you the map on which the location is identified. And these are the entry dates for the database. It's not the origin of the map name itself. Map names can have aliases and variants. In this case, Abiquiu had 24 variants. So one place does not always have the same name. There's information about map names. Each state has a book on place names. This, for example, is place names of New Mexico. Let's get some information about Abiquiu from this particular book. And I've kind of summarized it on the right. And what we can learn about Abiquiu from a place name book is early habitation within an old Indian pueblo abandoned in the 1500s. first Spanish settlers in the 1740s. It was the starting point of Armijo's Old Spanish Trail. The name is a corruption of Indian words. Interpretation of Indian names referring to the place includes runes, timber end place, hooting of an owl, and large grove. It's a historical center for Indian trade. It's the residence of artist Georgia O'Keeffe, whose paintings often reflect the local landscape. Has anyone heard of her? Okay. The opening shot of the fourth Indiana Jones movie, Indiana Jones and Kingdom of Crystal Skull, was photographed at this location. So place names have a lot of interesting history. Which way did Armijo go? It's a forensic exercise. We find the dots and we try to connect them. The dots are the journal landmarks. How we connect the dots is based upon the terrain or topography, historical travelways, and geographical hearsay. There will be a class on travelway forensics for Armijo's trip. Landscape travelways were generally controlled by water supply. They followed drainages, and they followed the base of mountains or side hills with drainage outlets. They wanted to have a water supply. There's good news and bad news about drainages. The good news is water supply. They have gentle, uniform slopes, and they can penetrate ridges or topographic barriers. The bad news is there can be considerable brush. They are traffic funnels. So they kind of keep people in an enclosed area, which if there are hostile Indians, may be a problem. They're subject to flash floods, and you can't always walk along the bank because the tributaries have steep gullies. Which way did Armijo go? Let's just kind of look at the first couple of days. We are looking at a shaded topographic map. The yellow areas have ground slopes between 7 and 33%, which I consider to be difficult for walking or traveling. The red have ground slopes greater than 33%, which may be barriers for travel. So we can see the first guess right here would be that between November 9th and November 7th, he followed the drainages. That's a logical travelway. We can see the topography is acceptable, and there's a continuous water supply. The red line is the proposed travelway for the National Historic Trail. Arguments for not following the streams include some of these locations have narrow, steep canyons. And also, Abiquiu was settled in 1740, so there's a lot of local knowledge about the landscape in this area. And from this local knowledge, it would have made sense to travel cross country and shorten the distance. The thing that isn't logical, well, let's back up for a minute. Okay, journal entries. They left Abiquiu. On November 8th, they stopped at the Rio Puerco River. It's not a point, so it could have been any point along this line. For the current proposed interpretation, the distance between November 8th and November 9th doesn't quite make sense. If they traveled this distance in one day, why do they travel such a short distance the next day? One possible explanation is that there is some interpretation that Arroyo de Agua was located further to the west, not where the current map name is. I think some people suggest Galena. So again, you can see that identifying the exact travelway location can be a forensic exercise. In 1846, to these large area maps, they did start adding travelways. Let's look at some blow-ups. This 1846 map includes the Oregon Trail. It's reported that Brigham Young had 6 copies of this map. And between these arrows right here, the Mormon Trail pretty much was in close proximity to the Oregon Trail. I think these location of these trails identify existence rather than our tools for navigation. The red is the map location for the Spanish Trail. The green is an overlay of today's proposed locations. So there is an issue of, I don't know if we want to call it accuracy, but anyway, the 1846 map showed there was a Spanish Trail, but its location, other than possible landmarks, wasn't suitable for navigation. The red line is the location of Armijo's Travelway according to the National Park Service and the BLM. If we look at this map, there's no issues at this map scale relative to location and topography. Location accuracy. We've got interpretation of journal points and alignments or travelways between them. On this red line could have possible errors, order of magnitude of miles. There's also errors or accuracy associated with different map scales. Initially, I believe that the trail was located on a 1 to 500,000 scale. That means 1 inch equals 8 miles on a map. The standards today for point location accuracy is 1,660 feet, and lines have less accuracy than points. I think it was refined recently this line was refined to be plotted on 1 to 100,000 scale maps. Here, it's 1 inch equals 1.6 miles. Again, the point accuracy is about 332 feet. Again, the line accuracy would have greater errors. Location, this trail is alive. Its location can grow and change. Its location is an ongoing research project. This is an example of the National Historic Trail location on the 1 to 100,000 scale map. And you probably can't see the detail, but it doesn't look too bad. Most hiking maps are at 1 to 24,000 scale. And so if we were to overlay this, and the Park Service hasn't presented it in that form, but if we were to overlay this proposed route, we could see that it goes right over the side of a cliff. So again, the proposed route is a travelway, and its accuracy is approximate. A location is approximately correct but precisely wrong. Point locations were interpreted from a translated 1829 Spanish journal. I think initially it was translated to French, then to English, but more recently there are direct English translations. Only a few journal locations refer to names on today's maps. Most journal locations describe the landscape. The location between points was interpreted and drawn considering topography, travelway assumptions, drainages, base of hills, historical trails, and geographic hearsay. There's been some attempt to get some oral history about travelways from different Indian tribes. And as we can see, they're identified on small-scale maps, which according to standards can have quite an error in accuracy. Armijo's National Historic Old Spanish Trail, its reality is an interpreted line on a map that connects interpreted landscape feature locations mentioned in a plus 180-year-old translated journal. It's a paper trail. The recreation promotion of National Historic Trails, I think, will involve segments and sites along the travelway with significant scenery or historical identity. It's not being promoted as a continuous hiking experience. There are several good references on the journal itself, and we can find those by doing a Google search on Spanish Trail. And hopefully you can find the Old Spanish Trail Association. And on that web page, you can find the many good references and a bibliography and maps about the subject. Next week, the topic will be becoming a National Historic Trail isn't easy. And again, Diana Hawks will be here to talk about it. And this is kind of the legal process of becoming and the history of becoming a National Historic Trail. The Old Spanish Trail is fairly recent. The feasibility, I don't think it became a National Historic Trail until around 2002. The management's report was just completed in 2017. So there's a lot to learn, and there may be a lot of changes. But next week we'll look at the legal process. Doug?
Yeah, are you going to tell us who Armijo was?
Well, he was a merchant, and we'll maybe get a little bit more on the third class. But he had a famous name. I think there are Armijos that were governors in New Mexico, but I'm not sure of if there's any relationship. Steve, can you help us out on this?
I don't know that other than he's a merchant.
Yeah. So if you do a Google search, you won't find out too much exciting. And there's been raised some question. You know, there are Armijos that were governors of New Mexico territory, but they're not sure about the relationship. And I think he lived to be about 50 years old. Yes?
I may have missed it, but I couldn't see where the trail crossed the Colorado River.
Crossing of the Fathers.
Right, and it's now covered by Lake Powell.
Say it again?
Crossing of the Fathers is the landmark, and which was identified before they constructed the dam that created Lake Powell. So right now it's underwater. So we can't.
Ferry area.
No, it was north. It was north of that. It was north of that. Okay, hopefully you come back and we'll see you next week.